Hey guys, this is Israel. Today we are going to be unit testing an API. This API follows the repository pattern. It is a .NET 5 API, but everything we're doing really translates up or down the versions of .NET, .NET 6, or .NET Core as well. With the repository pattern, we have our controllers, repository, and then our database access is handled within the DB context and entity framework, and then we have our SQL database in the background. So that is the project structure that we're going to be working with. We are using to test in this example MS test, but everything we are doing translates to NUnit, XUnit, or whatever unit testing framework you want to use. We will also be using Moq, which is a mocking framework for .NET, which quickly allows you to mock objects for unit testing and being able to control their behavior. This allows us to quickly create a mock of a dependency, such as a repository, so you don't actually have to test against your real data, your real database. AutoFixture is another good library we're going to be using in conjunction with Moq to quickly create test data for our mocked objects. The thing to remember here is we don't really care about the data we use as much as the results we get back to make sure that the code works as intended. So let's jump into the code and see how it's done. Let's go. Okay guys, so we are now back at the code. We are in the project. If you guys watched my video on the repository pattern, this is the same project. So this is just a project about getting employees, posting employees, putting employees, and deleting employees. That's all it is. Very simple. I'm going to show very quickly the project for those of you that haven't watched that video. So basically, I have an employee controller right here. We have an employee repository. We're following, obviously, the repository pattern, like I said earlier. So constructor, we have our get method, post method, put, and delete. All very straightforward things. Let me just show you guys. So we obviously have the interface for the repository. It is right here. We're just saying, we're going to get a list of employees. We're going to post an employee, put an employee, and then delete an employee and return a bool if it happened or not. And then our repository looks something like this. Again, very straightforward. We have our DB context, which is all just, entity framework and that stuff. And then we are going to just get, post, put, and then delete. All very straightforward stuff. If any of you guys have ever just worked with an API, you guys can see this is very straightforward things. And then our database is actually just one table. So we just have one table for employees, one DB set of employees. That's all we have there. So same thing, just the one model for an employee that has an ID, first name, last name, age. So let's say we want to add unit tests to this. We want to unit test our controller. Thankfully, since we did do the repository pattern, we do not have to really deal with unit testing the database context. That's not something that you really want to do. There are kind of complex and intricate ways you could theoretically test a DB context, but for the most part, the reason you do the repository pattern is so that you can kind of have your logic in your controller and everything that has to do with kind of accessing the database is kind of just stuck in the repository, and then you can just mock the repository, and then everything else around that is just pure functionality, and you want to make sure that when the code executes, that we end up getting the result that we want. And that's what we're unit testing. So you really don't want to unit test like the inside of a repository or mocking a DB context. You can do it, but for a lot of projects and in a lot of scenarios, it's a lot of hassle for for something that really doesn't make sense when you're unit testing. Now we're going to go ahead and create our testing project. So now we're going to go in here, right click, new project. We're going to do MS test. This is going to be a .NET Core, and I'm going to have to bump it up to .NET 5 for the target framework. If not, there's going to be a conflict there. And again, I'm using MS test. You guys can use whatever target framework. It's really only about syntax at a certain point. Let's do API test. That seems pretty good. Let's create that. Great. So now that we created this project, we need to add the reference to the other project, since this obviously test project depends on us having access to everything in the unit testing API. So we're going to add that dependency right here, right click, reference manager, right here, and then you select it. You should have that reference appear right here. Now that I set the reference, we do need to upgrade this project to .NET 5. If not, there's going to be a clash between these two, because this one I think initially is like .NET Core, so it needs to be upgraded. So let's upgrade that as well. Now that I've set the test project to .NET 5 and we have the dependency, back and forth checked. Now we can add the packages that we need. We can add Moq and we can add AutoFixture. So let's go ahead and do that. Like I said earlier, I like to use Moq when I want to make like the big objects. So kind of like the repository. I like to use Moq for that because it's very simple and straightforward, and I can very easily set what I want to return. And when it comes to AutoFixture, I really like to use that for the data objects because you can also customize them, be a little bit more meticulous, and it's also very fast and much faster than Moq. So that's kind of how I use both and why I use both. So Moq is installed, and now let's do AutoFixture. And we should be good to go now. So now that we have both, we can now move on. And I'm first of all just going to delete the default one. I kind of want to, go through all the steps with you guys. So let's get rid of this one. And let's create a new class. We are going to call this employee controller tests. And we create this. And now that we have this, the first thing we have to do is get all the testing stuff in here. So first of all, we're going to have the decorator of test class and import the package that we need for unit testing, just so that it knows this is a test class, and we're going to be, everything inside of here is hopefully going to be a test method or something that's going to be doing unit tests. So you'll see that when we actually get to the methods, we'll use the test method like tag attribute on top of this. So let's move on. Set this to public, and let's actually start to pull in, because the controller, what does the controller need? If you go back to the controller takes in the employee repository. So we need to Moq that. So this is where Moq comes in. So what we're going to do here, we're going to do private Moq employee repository. And now that we have that, that is what we're going to need. So this is how we Moq a repository. And now that we have this, we know that everything inside of here, so, these 4 methods and the direct data access to the database is all in here. So that we know that when it calls get, we want to set, some other employee. We do not want our actual employees to come back. We want to set fake data for that. And let me get Moq in here. We are using Moq, and we are using interfaces. So there we go. We have that set up now. Now that we have this, we will also want to pull in fixture so we can use all the goodies that go along with that. So let's pull private fixture. Now we have that in here. Let's get the using statement in here. Boom. And now we have that. And now we need to create our instance of the employee controller. So that's the next thing to come. Let's state that. Let's pull that one in as well. So we now have the repository that we're mocking. We have fixture for creating the objects that we're going to need when giving the repository the fake data. And then we have the employee controller, which is the one we are going to feed the repository into, so that the controller, when it's created, uses the mocked repository. And obviously, we're not going to feed it like the real one. So now we're going to need our constructor here. So employee controller tests, because we want to initialize these variables that we have right here. So now we have our fixture initialized, as well as our employee repository, our mocked employee repository. So now that we have this, let's go to our first method call, and that's going to be our get. So we're going to need to mock this employee repo.get, so that in the background, the code, whenever it goes through here, it's going to be able to just give it some type of employee, even though we don't really care about the result, as long as the code inside of here does not throw an issue, and we can just get through it and then eventually wait for this result. So let's see how that's going to look. So first of all, you're going to need your test method tag right here. And then we're going to do public async task. And then naming convention when it comes to the unit test methods is really up to preference. This is just kind of how I like to do it. but you can really name them however you want, as long as I guess it gets the point across to you or your team or whoever you're working with that kind of what's going on. I kind of like to say, what type of method it is, and then what are we getting, and then sort of what are we returning? Like, what is the return message that I should expect? That's kind of how I just like to name them, but you can really do kind of what you want, as long as I guess it's within y'all's standards at your company or that you enjoy, I guess. So then the first line of this is going to be, we're going to use fixture to create many employees that we have to bring in that model. So what is this doing right here? This is telling fixture to create many, and I gave it an actual number. So this is going to create 3 employee models with actual values in them, and it's going to return a list of them. As you can see here, it's going to give us a list of employees, and then we can use this employee data as we see fit, but now that's our fake data, if you guys understand. So now in this next line is where we're actually going to use this employee list that we just created. As you can see here, quickly change this. So when you actually have it here, we're setting up that on repository.get. So whenever it goes in here, and to just see what happens in there, let's go back. So on get in the repository, we are just doing basically the context employees to a list, and we're returning all the employees, which happen to be 3 in this case. That's all we have in the database, and it really doesn't matter for you guys to see it because it's a very simple, straightforward call, and we're not unit testing this. So all we want to do is for it to successfully return something here, and we don't get errors in here because we aren't unit testing this. We are unit testing this piece of code here, and that's something that I think is hard to understand at the beginning, but we don't really care what's in here. We only care about what executes here at this level, that unit of work. So going back here, we are now going to say whenever the employee repo goes and calls get, we just want to return that list of 3. Why? Because that's the result that we expect here, a list of employees from this get. And then the next step from here is now we create our employee controller. This employee controller, we're then going to pass in the repository, so that whenever you create your controller, as we can see in the constructor, it does not use, obviously, the real repo. It uses our fake one, which has this call to this. And now we can set our asserts and await our results from this. So basically, let me pull in object result. There we go. So what do we have here? Basically, now once we have this controller created, we call get. So now we are calling this method, but with our fake repo. And then going back here, we are expecting, this result of status code 200 with a result in it. And then you go in here, we are setting it as an object result so that I can actually access that status code. And then I'm just going to assert that I'm getting the 200 back, which is what I want. And we can just quickly debug right here. Let's debug this method. And if we debug this test, we can see that the result I got back was an object result with a status code of 200 and the value of 3 employee models right here, all with randomly generated data done all by fixture whenever you created them up here, up at the top. But that is what it is. And then you continue. We can step forward. We're going to see that what did I want? I wanted status code 200, which is okay. And that is the status code that I got back. So this test is going to pass. And that's how you do a get here. It's very simple. You use fixture here, and then you use kind of Moq to create this. And then that's kind of the setup of how you do all of these. It's obviously varies as you do, get, put, post, delete, all of that stuff. It varies a little bit, but definitely this is kind of the gist of how you want to do this. And now just to do the other side of this, let's do if you want to test, your get repo through an exception, and you want to be able to catch that. You want to make sure that your try catch here did what it needs to do, and it returns a bad request. So now let's do that. Let's move on to that one. So test method, public, async task, and then we are also going to do get. We are attempting to get employee or employees, but then we're going to throw exception because that's the expected behavior or what I'm testing for. So what do we do here? Now let's go. The difference here is we're not going to create an object. We're not going to create this because we don't want the repository to return this. What we want is a repository to throw a new exception. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky when it comes to testing for exceptions. it's going to depend on what your project's doing and the different types of exceptions maybe through development that you've seen, because this very basic exception will not catch very specific ones. So when testing for exceptions, it might get very specific, which is why you might have multiple try catches in your project checking for different types of exceptions. So at that point, it's kind of be on your hands when it comes to knowing what exception to throw here in your project to make sure that try catch covers all of that. But moving on from that, the next step is going to be very much the same as the other steps in the last one. It's basically going to be, you're going to create your new controller again, and you're going to pass in this employee repo with just as get throws new exception. You're now going to call get. The employee mock in the repo is going to throw an exception. And same thing as before, except this time we're asserting that a bad request was thrown. Because as you recall, if there was an exception, we want a bad request thrown. So we want status code 400. And now let's do that again. Let's just test it. As you can see from here, we have a bad request object result with a status code of 400. Stepping forward here, you're going to see object status code 400. So this is also going to pass. And boom, we now have get returns okay, get returns throw exception. So now let's move on to the other ones. I'm not going to do a throw exceptions for all the other methods since it's pretty straightforward and again, pretty arbitrary to whatever exceptions you want to throw and test for. But I'm going to just show you guys now how to do the post to put in the deletes and how to properly unit test those when it comes to, the repository pattern. We are now going to move on to, again, we are now doing post. It's going to be sort of the same style here. We're now doing post. We are posting an employee. And we are returning okay. And now again here, we're going to do something very similar as the get. We are going to create an employee. We're going to create an employee because this is the employee that's going to be created in the fake repo. So this is the employee we're creating. Whenever the repo or the fake repo calls post, we don't really care what employee goes in there or what employee is returned, as long as the repository code executes correctly and we can, in our controller here, just execute this code right here again. So it's just going to check, is the model state invalid? Which it should be, because we're creating an employee that goes through, obviously. But this should be correct. This should properly check, is the model we're passing invalid? And then this will execute as it should because we're telling it to execute properly. And then as long as nothing crazy were to happen here, our status code should be 200. But again, we have kind of these try catch, if else, just making sure that the stuff is being checked correctly. So another thing, if you don't really care about what values are being passed in anywhere, you can use this it.isAny, and then you can put any type that you want in here. Make sure to put these braces here. If not, it might not execute, and then you're gonna get a weird error. So just remember that this is kind of the syntax for it, and then you can just switch this out for anything you want, any type. Obviously, the correct one of what you're passing in, right? So the next step here is, again, going to be very similar to the last few. You're going to create your employee controller. You're going to pass in the repo mock, your controller.post, you're posting your employee, you're going to get a result. And we're, again, just testing for 200 okay. So let's again check this. And while I'm doing that, let's just, again, this is the post code. This is the post code right here. From body, you're sending an employee. And then in here, post, model state, very straightforward things. In the employee repository, all we're doing is context employees add async. We're just adding the employee in and saving changes. And then we're just returning what was created, usually, with the new ID of that new employee that was added. So you might want to send that back to the front end or do whatever they want to do with it. But as you can check here, we get a object result, again, with status code 200. So we're just going to set that type and again check, and it should pass. And boom, that is how you unit test a post. Now let's move on to put. I'm going to basically just move that one over since it's very similar and I don't want to take up a bunch of time. I'll just walk it through. Again, very similar. It's literally almost the exact same code, except slight little variation. And that's just because when you do a put, you actually do a get and then a post because it's an edit in essence. So if you go to the employee repository, you'll see that on put, you go first and retrieve the employee you're going to edit. You kind of reset their properties, and then you save changes. So that's what happens in the background. Does that matter, though, when it comes to the code that you're writing in the unit test? No. And why do I say that? Because, again, everything in there is handled in the repository, not in the controller. So going back to the actual unit test, we create an employee. We again do it is any employee because we don't really care. We are returning any employee, and we're doing put. Same stuff. Again, everything goes through. Do we get a status code result at the end of the day? And let's check it out. We look at our object here. Let's take one more step. Is our status code 200? Yes, it is. We look at our object. Again, 200. We have our model here, which was the edited one that we created right here. And everything works just fine. And now, finally, let's move on to our delete. So this one's going to be slightly different, but still not that crazy of a change when it comes to what we've been doing. So let me just move the method over here and we can just quickly see it and talk about it. So I don't waste too much time. We are going to have our delete employee returns okay. Same naming convention as before. Again, here, we aren't creating anything. We are deleting something. Does it really matter what we delete? No, because we're not dealing with actual data. We just know that when you do a delete here, the delete is going to return a bool for us. So all we have to do is pass in any ID, and then something's going to get deleted in here, and we just need a true here for the code to continue executing as we want it right here. So just to again show you the employee repository delete method, it is, where that ID, first or default, return it, remove it, and then save the changes. Very simple. Going back here, we now go back to our test, and now let's explain what the unit test is. We are passing it is any int, and then we're just going to return true, because that's all we care about in the repository. We create our controller. Controller.delete is any int, just because we don't really mind. We're going to get a result, and now let's test it. And then we again are just asserting that we get a status code because that is what we're looking for right here again. And again, you would just do the opposite. If you want to throw an exception, you would do the same thing that we did up here, but for all of these to then cover those try catch methods that you have. And now let's go down here. See, we have an object result, again, 200, value true. So everything worked fine. And now we have all passing test methods. So guys, this is how you unit test an API that follows the repository pattern. But if you guys enjoyed this video, please drop a like, please subscribe. There's going to be a lot more content on the way, and I'll see you guys at the next video.